This, of course, is new federal priorities for transportation, what California should be doing for Pete's sake. I told Bill it was in my contract. I had to read his headline there. For Pete's sake, with our, who knows, maybe the secretary will pop up on the screen here. As I said, we've got an excellent panel. We've got a little over an hour. We'll be taking some Q&A. Let me first read a disclaimer that again is in my contract. Several of these panelists served on the transportation transition team for the Biden administration, but they do not speak for the administration, and their comments in this session will be limited to their personal views and their past professional experiences, which is pretty remarkable because here's who we have on this panel. As you heard from earlier, Anthony Foxx, former US Secretary of Transportation under President Obama and Chief Policy Officer for Lyft currently. We have Toks Omishakin, who's the director of Caltrans. Everybody knows Toks, also though coming most recently from the Tennessee Department of Transportation, and before that, the city of Nashville. Therese McMillan, Executive Director of the Metropolitan Transportation Commission, MTC, who I had a pleasure working with both at MTC, but also back in Washington, where she served as the Deputy Administrator and Acting Administrator of the Federal Transit Administration. And last but not least, Phil Washington, Executive Director of LA Metro, who has had a remarkable career in the transportation industry and has been lauded and had too many awards I can't even keep track of, and did remarkable things in both Denver and LA. And we're glad we have you all here. I finally get to moderate a federal panel where we don't have to say, what if the federal government was going to do something big on infrastructure and transportation? Because it seems like and sounds like they're going to do something big. So as I told all of you, and for our audience out there, this is going to be a free-form discussion. There are no opening comments or remarks. We're going to jump right into this, and I'd like you to ask each other questions too, or jump in when you need to. So let's start. Normally, we might start with the possibility of a transportation reauthorization bill, and I do want to get there. But in front of that, it seems we have this talk about a massive infrastructure stimulus. And I say massive. We had heard even numbers last summer of 2 trillion. I've now more recently heard 3 trillion. Of course, not just transportation in this case. It looks like there may have been a template from last summer in Congress, perhaps with HR 2 in the House, looking really broadly at infrastructure, utilities, broadband, wastewater, as well as transportation. So Anthony, as the former Secretary of Transportation, I want to start with you. What do you make of this talk of the stimulus, and given the experience you've had, what do you think this administration needs to do, and how fast do they need to do it in order to succeed? And you're on mute.
Yeah, James, thanks for moderating, and it's great to join this great panel. All of the other panelists actually maybe have a deeper insight than I do, but let me just say this: when we were looking to follow on MAP 21 back in the day, I spent an inordinate amount of time with Vice President Biden, then Vice President Biden. We toured the country. We pushed for stronger reauthorization, and got the FAST Act passed, which at the time seemed like humongous relative to a 2-year reauthorization package that we'd seen before. What I learned in that process was that this now president was an infrastructure person. He believes in it. He lives it. He breathes it. It got him home day and night to Delaware. And so I think at the very top, you have someone who not only has a love of what infrastructure can do, but a deep understanding of how it all comes together. So that's an enormous strength for this effort. What I expect is that they will go big, because he's not only well aware of some of the challenges we face with building out a more aspirational infrastructure vision, but he's also aware that we're in a globally uncompetitive situation right now. China is frankly cleaning our clock, not only within the 4 walls of China, but they're also building partnerships with other countries around the world and getting known as an infrastructure leader. And I think this president understands that to be competitive, we have to do more. So I expect a multimodal package. I expect it to focus not just on highways, but on rail, on transit, on all these other things. I expect a very strong state of good repair, but also getting into some areas that allow more integration of transportation, like micromobility. And again, we're seeing fast growing areas of the West as well as the South that need new transit to be built, while we're also trying to repair existing transit infrastructure. So a heavy bent towards that. But I'm the antique roadshow. Let's hear from the folks that may know better than me.
Phil, Therese, what do you think about the prospects? And remarkable too, Phil, obviously leading LA Metro. We've now just had a couple of, I never thought I would see such a massive stimulus bill that would actually have not just transit funding, but transit operating funding. That's brand new coming out of DC.
Well, let me say, first of all, it's an honor to be on this panel with my three friends, and a former secretary as well. That's a bonus. Listen, I think it's about time. I think it's about time. I think, in some respects, we have been on what I call an infrastructure vacation for the last few decades in terms of looking at infrastructure in a holistic way. And so the idea of looking at these looking at a multimodal package that extends beyond transportation, broadband, bridging the digital divide, and water and all of those things is very, very exciting. One of the things I think about is, first of all, the infrastructure is multi-generational. And so, building the highway system, multi-generational, all of the great infrastructure projects in this country were built over a number of years. And so I think now is the time, as we have built up to what I think is a crescendo of need in this country around infrastructure. Now is the time, and I think it's perfect timing for this administration to now push a large infrastructure package. And when I see $3 trillion, that really, really excites me. And so, we can talk about what should be in that and all that. And I think there'll be, lots of heads around the table on that. But what concerns me, and perhaps we can get into this, is how to deliver. Once we get an infrastructure bill, how do we deliver the packages? In terms of the projects, how do we sequence projects? When you look at Justice 40, that is in Build Back Better, what does that mean? Justice 40 is talking about 40% of infrastructure dollars going to low-income communities. What does that mean? And do we have the structure right now to get that money to those low-income communities? Is the grant criteria set up to do that? There's a lot of work to do. And so as practitioners, we should be asking, what does that mean? And, for all 50 states, what does that mean for California? Is there a list of regional and national significant projects? Is there a sequence? Passing a bill is great. That is a great first step. But what about delivery? And what about implementing such a massive program? I'm really, really concerned about that. And I'm really anxious to hear how that's going to work out, because the devil is going to be in the implementation details and the delivery details of such a massive program. And I think while we will, dance in the streets with the passage of an infrastructure bill, hopefully it's big, that is just beginning the discussion with regard to implementation and delivery.
I'd like to pick up on something that Phil said and maybe give a slightly different perspective. I think we can never lose sight of the fact that this stimulus is coming on the heels of a global health economic crisis, the likes of which we have never seen. And that is going to continue to set, in my view, the context and the urgency, and maybe in ways we don't fully understand the nature of what this is. Because we're, unfortunately, a year in, we're still in some ways in the COVID response situation. I mean, thank God we've finally gotten the vaccines out, but we're still just trying to keep our heads above water. The rebuilding phase of economies that have been crushed, rural, suburban, big agencies and whatnot, that's, I think, a context within this which the stimulus is happening. And so we're going to see, I think, a really interesting dynamic of the quick strike, quick build, things you can get on the ground really quickly, because that's that economic engine. That's that shot, to use maybe a poor metaphor, shot in the arm, that a lot of our economy is going to need to come back. But then that needs to be balanced with the more generational, longer term infrastructure needs that were there before the pandemic. So the infrastructure needs have actually been exacerbated and complicated by having now this incredible economic devastation that we're trying to come back from. And I would also add to Phil's point, the ability to deliver, I think, is going to be even more challenging, because you're talking about cities, counties, townships that are still trying to get on their feet. And a major part of working with the federal government has been partnerships. It's been leverage. It's been, what can you bring to the table? But we have to, I think, allow that there's going to be this space when folks are still scrambling to get back on their feet in order to be those good partners. And so that's going to be an interesting dynamic. I think that's quite different from circumstances we've seen in the past.
What I hear you both saying is, are we ready, right? Are we ready to respond if that stimulus comes? And it's interesting, you think back to ERA back in 2009, a very different kind of global crisis, right? And I think we were asking the same questions back then. Do we have the projects that are ready to respond to the economic conditions, and in this case, as you say, Therese, the global health crisis? So Toks, as Caltrans and overseeing the state's transportation network, what's your take on the stimulus, and how are you thinking about this from the state's perspective, from Caltrans' perspective, from the goals that you've outlined since you've arrived here in California?
Yeah, thanks, James, and thanks for moderating. Thanks for stepping in for Bill. Bill was gonna chicken out anyway, so I think you're great for batting for him in this place, and it's good to see my friends Therese and Phil. We spent a lot of weeks in the last the waning months of 2020 and the early part of 2021 doing some weekend work to help out the incoming folks. So always good to be with them on a panel, and to Secretary Foxx, somebody I always enjoy reaching out to for feedback. Good to be on a panel with you as well. So, the big three at Caltrans, and I think I've shared this with you guys before, but the big three really for us when it comes to a stimulus or a full reauthorization, the big three are, number one, safety. I mean, that's our biggest calling card. That's our biggest responsibility. I don't think we talk about it enough, but from a safety standpoint, what needs to happen? Climate, obviously, with our state facing the challenges that it's facing more than anybody else. And number three is equity. From an equity standpoint, what are we going to do? What does a stimulus package look like, and what does a reauthorization look like? in particular, what Phil said about the Justice 40 program is something that I'm spending a lot of time just kind of thinking about how that's going to happen, the implementation of that, because there's a really big opportunity in front of the administration to send things in a different direction. Because when you think about all the prior bills, Secretary Foxx talked about MAP 21 and the FAST Act, and if you go back further, ICE-T, there's always one or two things you can point to from those bills that you can say, boy, that was a big change. That was a bit of a dramatic shift in how the federal government's doing things. So if you go back to, I think it may have been 91 when ICE-T passed, it was the first time that the US federal government started to look at multimodal transportation and put it into a bill and said each state needs to have a bicycle and pedestrian coordinator and started to focus on transit funding. That was a big major step in 1991. This period right here, the opportunity all of us have, Secretary Foxx is like the godfather now. He's out of the way, but we're still running the traps on this. And Phil looks like he's trying to run away too. We're somehow going to have to keep him in the mix. But this is an opportunity to pivot, unlike ever before. We should take advantage of this momentum and discussion about equity. I think the climate stuff is good. The safety stuff, we're going to do it. But what are we really going to do about how we've made poor decisions in transportation in underserved communities, and how do we start to reverse that and uplift? This is that moment, and hopefully the plan. And I don't mean to belittle, safety and climate. Believe me, I think those are critical. But the pivot on equity is huge in any kind of bill that comes down.
Let's talk about that, okay? You all know you're incredibly experienced professionals. We have had to adhere to executive orders. We've had to think about environmental justice and equity as transportation professionals for quite some time. Many of us have worried sometimes it gets to be a box checking exercise, or it isn't as genuine and as deep as it needs to go. And I think, Toks, those are excellent thoughts in terms of the pivot we're about to undergo here. I would even say, coming back to California after a decade away back in DC, I'm gonna say this, maybe it's provocative. I think we have better tools in California right now to measure the climate impacts of our investments than we do the equity impacts of our investments. So talk to me about what does it look like to actually meet the administration's challenge on racial equity? What does it look like to understand how do we reverse the history, the ugly history sometimes that Secretary Pete's been talking about, and to actually have transportation investments that truly benefit racial equity that we know from the ground up? And tell me a little bit about your experiences on the ground in your regions, in your agencies, because you've all been grappling with this for a long time.
Well, I'm happy to jump in, because I'm reflecting, James, on the time I was at FTA, and really inspired and motivated by a president and an administration that pushed equity to the forefront in ways that hadn't happened before. But the thing I think that will continue to be a challenge for dealing with this question at a national level is that true equity is community driven. It is meeting people where they are on the ground. And it's not impossible, but it's harder, I think, when you're in Washington, DC, to make that kind of community connection. And so for me, there's two things I want to point out. One, again, that genuine, we use the term authentic almost too much, but certainly this is something that Secretary Foxx, stressed, was, what is the engagement? What is the discussion with people that needs to happen in terms of listening to the stories, listening to their histories, giving validation to the past actions that were wrong, and letting them co-create what the solutions are. And I think, again, the federal government and state governments and regional, government in general likes to kind of do that top down. Oh, here's your solution. You just need to have more bike lanes in your community, or whatever the case may be, as opposed to trusting that the community can develop the solutions and then we can fund what they believe they need. And I think that's a dynamic that's incredibly important. We lived and breathed that, Phil, right? With LA Metro for sure. And so that's one thing. To enable that, though, because it is really important, data. I'm so glad you brought it up, because part of the challenge, unfortunately, still is proving that inequities exist and they need to be dealt with. And frankly, with the skeptics, you need to have the data, you need to have the information, and you need to be able to measure progress in terms of changing things. And so this idea of having really powerful, reliable equity metrics that aren't just transportation, but they're health metrics, they're housing, they're across the board, is really important. And the federal government supporting that development would be a huge tool in the proverbial toolbox I think we'd need.
I'll add a couple of thoughts here. I love what Therese is saying, because the current state of a lot of infrastructure in this country says to a very large number of people who are our neighbors that we don't respect you. We didn't care about you when we built this. We didn't listen to you when we built this. And that is still very raw. That doesn't mean that it's irreversible. It just means that we have to understand that the level of disrespect that the infrastructure system has piled underneath it is very deep. It is very, very deep. And what Therese is saying is that we have to think about A to Z here. We have to think about the public input process differently. We have to think about how we talk about infrastructure differently, using technical terms with, people who are, working 2 jobs and traveling a bunch of different, you have to be able to talk to people in real terms about what's actually under discussion. I think, if you wanted me to give you a laundry list of things that I would love to see happen, I'd like to see some freeways torn down in this country that are reminders of that division. And there is actually legislation that has been filed in Congress to provide a program to do that. That doesn't mean every freeway needs to go away. I think there are a lot of them that still provide a travel advantage, but there's some that don't. And that reclaimed land could be affordable housing, it could be open space, it could be a lot of things that would improve the urban environment. There's another aspect of this, which is the economic impact of equity. We have a disadvantaged business program within the federal government that says that if you do too well in that program, you graduate out of it. But when you graduate out of it, there's no place for you to find an input to grow your business from being small to medium to large. And so we find a lot of contractors getting stuck there. So could a program be put together that would help those companies with bonding and improve the requirements so that businesses could grow? And then there's also, I think anytime we think about, expanding transit, particularly, like I said, in areas of the South and the Western United States, where they're transit starved, that's going to have an opportunity to give us more equitable transportation. So there's a lot that could be done here, but a lot of it would be very new. And the last point I would make is that we need to start looking at our state boards of transportation, which lack diversity. We need to look at every level of the decision-making process and ensure that people are at the table. And, the reality is, if we don't change those ingredients in the ecosystem, it's going to be very difficult to deliver on equity because the equity is not at the table.
Yeah, I would add to what all three other speakers are talking about. I mean, I agree with everything. Toks was talking about how much of a game changer equity is in the infrastructure space, and that is really, really true. We all know the history, how infrastructure has historically divided communities. When Secretary Foxx talks about highway, I'm from the south side of Chicago. The Dan Ryan Expressway was put right in the middle of the city to really separate black and white. I mean, I'm old enough to remember that. I'm a child of the civil rights movement. My mother took me to marches and all those kind of things. And I think, people talk now about, it's almost a buzzword right now, when people talk about connecting communities. And every time I hear that from someone, I think, do they really know what they're talking about? I mean, do they really know the true meaning of connecting communities? And because what we're talking about then is breaking down many of those things that we're talking about right now that Secretary Foxx just talked about. And we really serious about connecting communities. I mean, wow, that is huge. And if we are talking about connecting communities in the equity framework, should that be part of grant criteria? I'm very concerned that as we begin to talk about money going to low-income communities, and as we begin to talk about these, the first thing we need to be doing is changing the grant criteria for money that is now going out. And I'm happy to see that that's happening now. I mean, I think the infra grants are being looked at. Those are the kinds of things that we need to look at. And it goes back to the implementation discussion of infrastructure dollars. If we are to say there's going to be a Justice 40 provision, then, hey, show me how to change the grant criteria, because some of it can be changed administratively. Some of it can be changed, it has to be changed legislatively. So now, if we are really serious about the business of connecting communities, of Justice 40, of all of that, we learned so much, and Toks and Therese can probably add to this. When we talked to the tribal nations during the transition, it was incredible. It was incredible to me to listen to the tribal nations talk about, hey, listen, we may not have those population centers, so the grant criteria that talks about population centers means nothing to us, right? And the technical capacity of folks in these communities, whether it's rural, urban, or whatever, to even fill out grant applications. So I think when we talk about equity, it is so much that is under that and so much that's important to that. Secretary Foxx talked about mid-sized programs. I mean, we set up a mid-sized program for our locally funded projects here. But when we talk to the federal government about, hey, we should set up some mid-sized programs, I didn't hear anything else from them. So I think that there's so much to the equity discussion. We're just scratching the surface on it.
Go ahead, Toks.
Just real quick, if I could add, before you shift gears, James, I just want to give a little bit of credit to Secretary Foxx, but before that, I completely agree with what Phil just said and what Therese said, especially about the engagement part of this. We can go into this, with a new reauthorization and just say, we know what needs to happen. I think what they're cautioning us on is we need to be careful about baking the cookie fully without really having a conversation about what kind of, what, for lack of a better analogy, what kind of cookie we're really talking about here. But this conversation reminds me of when I was in Tennessee at one point, when this issue used to come up. I was really afraid, because of the setting I was in, I was really afraid to actually start to push our state on this issue as much as I thought I could, even though I wanted to. And part of the way I was able to get to the place where I could really start to push on this issue, specifically on how highways have created the division, was actually Secretary Foxx and the Ladders of Opportunity program that he started at DOT. Once I saw that come out from him and he started to publicly talk about, this is the secretary saying, yeah, freeways, they gutted my neighborhood in Charlotte, and we really need to rethink how we're, building highways throughout communities. I started to talk about it more. And I was actually traveling the country a ton at the time, and I talked about this quite a bit. So I said that to say, just the opportunity to push this issue, as we all have been doing, all of us in this meeting, we've been doing it. I think is a huge step in itself. And Secretary Buttigieg obviously gets it as a former mayor, but now comes to what Phil was saying, now comes the rubber hitting the ground. Like, how are we going to implement this? And there's a big opportunity, a big pivot opportunity in front of us. So pretty cool.
So for the purposes of our audience here listening today, the California audience, virtually all in front of you, it sounds to me like collectively we're going to have to make our equity case, and not just in a check the box, but what's coming out of the Biden administration anyway is going to be pretty different. Is going to be, I think, sounds like I'm hearing you say, more meaningful, and we should be prepared. The thing that, Therese, you said, we're really good at top down in government, right? And the irony there is that part, it seems to me, of the ingredients you're talking about is a much different kind of bottom up planning process, engagement process. What do you expect from, what can our audience expect then from the feds in terms of that? I mean, if it's coming down from the top, are they going to be looking for a deeper engagement process on projects?
Well, I think this is the opportunity to advocate for it, right? I mean, I think we need to have the voices, in DC right now, as we're going into authorization, as we're going into stimulus, as we're going into these programs, to say that's an essential piece. And look, a large part of it is going to be, at least in my perspective, a flexibility, a trust in flexibility that allows, and we used to use this term all the time, right? One size doesn't fit all, but it's really true, and whether it's different parts of the country, whether it's, our rural communities, which face abject poverty, as we all know, and in ways that are very different than what, we see in urban areas, that there's going to have to be, I think, a shift in the paradigm that says, we're going to allow you to come out with a different approach as long as you can demonstrate improved outcomes that we're seeking in terms, whether it be, resilience or, GHG reduction, improved equity for impacted communities, whatever. If you can demonstrate changed outcomes to the benefit of what they are, then we're going to give you the flexibility of how to use the funding. Now that's really different. We have a few, we had Tiger, Infra, there's some areas where we began to play in that space. But I think we need more of it, particularly if we are going to, as Phil and others, I think, and we know, pointing out, also build the capacity of communities to be able to step into that space. The San Francisco Bay Area, my MPO, has a lot of resources. We're able to do some things more so than other places because of that historic thing. But for smaller areas, they don't have that capacity. And if you want communities to be able to, as I said, sort of create the solutions, we're also going to have to invest in their capacity building too. And that's something that, people like things, they don't like process, but at some point, I think you do need to equally invest in the process of building community capacity. And I would like, I would certainly think that this administration, if anyone, would have a listening ear to that. And I think we should ask for it.
Can I add to that as well? Because I've been dreaming about this. I've been dreaming about what is replicable at the federal level in terms of implementing a massive program. As Therese said earlier, some infrastructure has got to be done quickly. I mean, there's an urgent need. I'm thinking, lead in drinking water and, all of these things, right, are infrastructure in my mind, just not, it's not just transportation, as we all know. But this idea now of a bottoms up engagement is something that we need to be thinking about in terms of implementing a large federal program. So what I've been dreaming about is this idea, not unlike what we did with Measure here in Southern California. We gave the various Council of Governments targets in terms of dollar targets. And we said to them, you identify your projects. Here is the dollar targets. Here are both current year dollar targets and year of expenditure dollar targets. You identify your own projects. We then put together the criteria. And we asked our board to approve the criteria before they saw the projects. Hello. We asked them to approve the criteria. The criteria was, 5 major areas with a whole lot of, stuff underneath it. And Therese helped put all that together as the Chief Planning Officer of Metro. And we took those projects and then we evaluated those projects against the criteria. And that is how we came up with the sequence of the projects based on how they scored over a 40-year period with a sales tax initiative that has no sunset. And that's another thing. I think the infrastructure bill should have no sunset at the federal level as well, because infrastructure never ends when you talk about state of good repair and maintenance and all of that. And so you are then evaluating those projects, sequencing those projects around the country, and you're laying out then when those projects are done and the groundbreakings for those projects, also based on regional and national significance as well. And I think the last part of that is providing a local return to all 50 states. To all 50 states in an infrastructure bill where communities, where states get money on an annual basis based on some criteria around that, maybe current population, future population, current employment, future employment. And so I think thinking like that and putting in outcomes and what are the outcomes, what Therese was talking about, I think makes sense. And then the last thing I would say is these kinds of ideas are going to come from the local communities and regionally. I don't know if I'm banking that some great program comes out of the federal government. I mean, historically, we had the WPA, back in, the 1930s, early 30s, great program that came out of the federal government with Harry Hopkins and all of that. But I think these programs have to be locally initiated and recommended to the federal government, and then they can be replicated at the federal level.
Let me go into this is really interesting, and I want to pivot a little bit here. We're getting some questions in the chat, which are pretty interesting. I'd have the panelists look at those more recently about universal basic income, using Lyft as a model to connect lower income residents to key essential services. I don't have to tell any of you this, we're probably facing for mass transit one of the biggest crises that it has seen in decades. And thank goodness there has been some support through the last couple of stimulus bills. I don't know where it would be without that, and a lot of folks advocating for it in DC. But there's an inherent tension, right, between a lot of our transit agencies and the need to basically maintain them and not have them run off the fiscal cliff. And Anthony, I look at you and your smart cities hat on and the Lyft experience you have. we have some micro transit and some flexible transit experiments. And Phil, I know you've got this going on in LA too, under the auspices of LA Metro and your Office of Extraordinary Innovation. But talk a little bit about this tension between where we're going on shared ride, point to point, public-private, and the critical need, the critical equity benefits of a lot of our transit operators and our transit services. And what can we expect from the feds on this in the next few years?
Well, I'll opine on this from the following standpoint. Number one, first principle is that public transit is irreplaceable. There are aspects of public transit that no private industry could ever replicate, nor should it. And as a result of that, I've always taken the view that it was a mistake that the federal government in the 1980s removed operating support from transit systems. I think it is critical, not only now because of the crisis, but I think more on an ongoing basis that support be renewed, because there's so much more transit agencies can do if they have a bit of a safety net underneath them to serve their mission. I think there are gaps though. The last mile is a place where there are a lot of opportunities through land use, through the presence of micromobility and other tools to connect people to that stop, either on the way to or the way from, that get people from point to point and can be good accelerants of transportation. So I think there are a lot of innovations that can occur between public and private that would help enable more people to have access to transit. And I think this is an opportunity, frankly, for those innovations to be explored.
Do you think we're going to see a Smart Cities 2.0 from this administration?
I expect so. I mean, I was an advocate for that very early on, and just full disclosure, I was an early supporter of Vice President Biden, then Vice President Biden, now President. And so I was part of helping craft the initial campaign platform around transportation. And if you look at it, there is a call for a larger, broader smart city program. I think there are some key components of that program that are critical. One is that I think it's still competitive. I think that adds an element of urgency to the local proposals, and I think it also fosters more innovation. But I also think the critical component there, and I think we've learned this from infrastructure over generations, which is as much as I love engineers, and many of my best friends are engineers, they will only solve the problem they're asked to solve. And if you have a broad criteria, as Phil said, that includes equity as part of a smart city kind of challenge, what will happen is not only will you see innovations occur in a city or a community, even a rural community, that speak to that equity, but now you're teaching the marketplace, the technology providers, how to do this in a more replicable fashion. And I think that buying power of cities as leveraged by federal dollars is critical in helping technology actually help us solve some of these problems.
Let's talk a little bit about, if we, some of you had touched on rural, right? Phil, you talked about engaging a lot of the tribal communities. What do you think we can expect from this administration, the Congress, and we have a lot of mid-sized regions, a lot of smaller cogs in the audience today, a lot of places like myself that represent downtown Sacramento and some very rural parts of my region. What do you think? Where do you think they fit in the equation with this administration, the Congress? Are there openings?
Well, yeah, I'll take the first crack at it, and then Therese and Toks were, involved in this as well during transition. I do believe that the administration will outreach to rural communities, and I do believe they will outreach to what I mentioned, the tribal nations. I think we have to. But I think that we have to put together a mechanism for that outreach. I'm not sure we have that yet. I mean, how do we hear from them? How do we hear from the rural COGs? I mean, how do we do that? And so I think at the federal level, well, first of all, is there a roll up for communication and outreach purposes from those communities up all the way up to the federal government? I don't think there's a mechanism to do that right now. And I think that, there ought to be sort of, a federal function, in this case in DOT, maybe there is, and I don't know about it, but some sort of federal function that just, their role is to hear from those folks that are on the ground, whether it's COGS or whether it's a roll up from through the state up to the federal government. That is their sole function, to hear and to convey to the decision makers in this case USDOT. And I think if we don't have that, then we will not know what they're thinking. The last thing I'll say is, and I'll go back to the tribal nations. I mean, we spent, I want to say, an hour and a half, almost 2 hours on a phone call with the chiefs and the leaders of the various tribal nations. And it was eye-opening. It was eye-opening on their infrastructure needs. And I know that there's an office, I believe in USDOT, that sort of manages that. And I'm not saying they're not doing a good job, because, they may be. But the needs are so great. And unless we find out on an ongoing basis, not a one-time basis, can't be a one-time basis, it has to be frequent, what they're thinking and what their needs are, I think we're going to fail in this area.
So just real quick, first on the former question, and then to the last part. I was trying to jump in there just real quick. I think in government, we can't forget that in this space, our responsibility ultimately is to, as safely and efficiently as possible, move people and goods. I mean, that's the very big picture. That's kind of like what we're trying to do. And so you mentioned that inherent sort of conflict between TNCs and transit and all that stuff. I think what the administration should try to do, and that's part of what we're doing in our jobs, is, how do we make sure these things are more connected and as seamless as possible? And look, I understand Secretary Foxx works in a for-profit entity now, and they probably more focused on, they may be, I don't know this, I'm pretending to speak for them, they may be more focused on, generating income for the business. But our job in the government space is like, how do these things always work together? How do we make sure that TNCs and transit and the highway system and rail, and how does it fit together? That's our job, and not to create conflicts and barriers between them. One of the things we're doing in California, everybody on, is where it's Cal ITP, and trying to figure out how to seamlessly, as much as possible, connect those different mediums or tools that we use to get around. So just real quickly on that inherent conflict you mentioned. But on the latter part of what you just brought up, that Phil was mentioning, we obviously can't go into detail, but probably one of the most enlightening conversations we had, and not to belittle any of the other conversations, but just hearing their perspective was really impactful and helpful to us, because most of the other people we were engaged with were in this space. They were working on transportation and stuff. And, just listening to elected officials from tribal governments and saying, them just breaking down simple things like, look, got a formula program here that's just broken. We're falling short in this formula program in the money that we get. But I think besides the Native American component of this, or tribal nation component of this, I think we need to try to figure out and talk more and more about what rural communities, what all the communities we serve have in common. I think we spend a lot of time talking about how different urban and rural are and suburban are, but what do they all have in common? Like, what's the thing that links us all together? And we need to spend most of our energy and time, including in a potential bill and stimulus on that. And a big part of that is what pulls us all together is the economic piece. The fact that transportation means so much economically to communities. And I think in whatever comes down, a lot of energy needs to be spent on, okay, how can we make these communities, how can we improve the vitality of these communities, especially economically and including their quality of life? But just some quick thoughts on that.
Thanks.
You know, I'd like
Go ahead.
to pick up on something there and maybe pivot to another subject I know near and dear to all of us. You know, one of the reasons that, you know, having lived in the space as a federal government employee overseeing a program, you know, we love separating things into a rural program, and here's an urban program, and here's, you know, we balkanize things and give them labels. We love labels and buckets, right? And I would love to see in the climate resilience space enter in with a whole different view, because if there to that uniting theme, Toks, if there is one thing we all share, is that our planet is in really deep trouble. And the economic devastation that we've been seeing, again, just look at California, right? With the unbelievable wildfires that ripped through the state, and a lot of rural communities absolutely suffered the front end of all of that.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we talk a lot about sea level rise, and it gets a lot of weight because our big urban centers very often are on the coast, you know, whether it's, you know, LA or Houston or, you know, New York and, you know, the Bay Area and the Pacific Northwest, Seattle. So there's been a focus, you know, sea level rise has had in many ways sort of an urban tilt to it because of its impact, but climate change and how it affects the entire country. So as this administration has carried a big banner to say, this is something that we are going to deal with, I think it would be really interesting to see if we could approach that in a different way and not break it up immediately into urban and rural pots or strategies or programs, but really think about the problem definition and the solutions in that space in a very different and creative way. And, you know, the last thing I would say is one thing that has been really important in this conversation back is equity. You know, it is our most vulnerable communities that suffer the most as a result of climate change and its impacts. And it's the poorer communities who are often left behind in the conversation in terms of, you know, what this means to them and how they recover. And importantly, not just look to the future of how we're going to sustain ourselves better, because, you know, that, you know, whether we're switching to EVs, you know, electric vehicles, or, you know, whatever the case may be, there's also this resilience piece, which is how are we going to deal with the damage that has already been done and is irreversible? And how do we, you know, make sure that we can make strides to protect our communities already? And I know in the Bay Area, we're doing a lot of that thinking. So I think this is it's an opportunity to approach the whole federal intervention in a different way. And I think that's really exciting.
And if I could add one other thought to what's been said, you know, I think this is one area where this, you know, all of you who are listening here have an outsized say. one of the things that I learned as secretary, and notwithstanding an important point that Phil made earlier about how the criteria are written, like we're captive to the criteria at the federal level. So, you have to speak to that when you're crafting proposals. But the innovation is likely going to happen locally and at the state level. In other words, the projects come from you. The projects come from, your thing. And so I think this whole idea that, rural, urban splits and all the things we're hearing about in politics, it's somewhat ridiculous when you think about the fact that, somebody is like working in the central business district, they live in a rural area, or people who are eating at restaurants in the urban area are buying food that's produced in the rural area. Like, we're part of the same ecosystem, and our decision-making process oftentimes exacerbates these lines. And so the more proposals can be fashioned that reinvent that system and bring these conversations together and get people across these lines talking to each other, I think that's where a lot of the real power is. And the last thing I'll say is that I think equity, and I want to be careful when I say this, and I'll tell you why. I think equity has an ecumenical meaning. In other words, it isn't just Black, Latino, it's also rural. And there's a huge dimension of this conversation that I think has not been talked about frontally, but I think this administration would be very wise to craft the way that it talks about and deals with equity in a way that picks up the kind of inequities we see in rural America as well as in urban America and elsewhere. The only caveat I would make to that is that there are some communities that, as a historical matter, when all of these inequities are sort of put in one bucket, they still end up getting the last bit of it. And so I think we still have to pay attention to some of how these dimensions play out. But I think there is a huge opportunity to actually bring this country together by focusing on equity and tearing down some of these ridiculous divisions that people sometimes buy into.
Well, I hear several themes here. One of which is, and in California, as you all know, and we're big supporters of moving to trying to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. The transportation sector has a huge role to play in that. Yet I would also say it's true that a lot of our greenhouse gas and climate law makes a lot of our mid-sized regions and rural regions think, wow, how am I going to do this, right? What's my, and what I think what I hear you saying, Therese, and you kind of nailed this earlier, is it might be climate for some of our, climate might be a frame you hear coming out of the Biden administration, but resilience, preparedness, we're all in this together. And let me just check and make sure I've got this right. That to me seems like a frame that is, as anybody is going to the federal administration, you're a member of Congress, that this Congress and this administration is going to be all over, right? We've got to think about our investments and our asks to this administration that way. Phil, can I, one thing that's been chatted here is, and one I wanted to ask you about this, which is fare free transit, okay? So little pivot here, but interesting, right? As we think about the economic signals and congestion pricing and the price that encourages or discourages, we've also got, as Therese does, and all of us do all over the state and the nation, fare media, right? The cost of transitioning and keeping up with technology to go to a universal fare card, how much that's going to cost. You tell us a little bit about the fare free, your thoughts on fare free, and whether you think this is something the administration is going to look at.
Well, let me say a couple of things on this first. I mean, I have folks that hate the idea. I have folks that are supporters. I have folks all over the map. I've heard from a lot of different people. Just a little bit of background on Los Angeles, first of all. Most diverse region in the country. LA Metro has the highest percentage of low-income riders in the country, at about 70, a little over 70%. The next highest percentage of low-income riders, I believe, is Chicago, my hometown. And so if you put it in that context of, and this fits into the equity argument, this is actually, in my opinion, implementing equity. Because again, we talk about equity. Hey, I'm about implementing equity, right? So this is, in some respects, the mother of all equity, of saying that we are looking to take away the expense of transportation for the highest percentage of low-income riders in this country. That's the sort of the background on this. And also loosening the burden, due to housing unavailability and the lack of affordable housing in a region where we have the highest percentage of homelessness in America as well. So that's sort of the backdrop. And so I believe that we have a moral obligation to at least study the impacts of a fareless system. And that is why we put together a task force to do this. I also believe that public transportation, if we're serious about climate change, and if we're serious about reducing, emissions, which transportation we know is the biggest offender of, if we're serious about that, then fareless transportation, fareless transit, I should say, could be just one of the ways we attack this. And so we have presented this. We have said that transit should be looked at just like a fireman. I mean, we pay property taxes and all that. So, in some ways, we pay for, firemen to come along, put out a fire. Libraries are free. And so I think that transit should be considered like them and be fareless. So we have been studying this. We are proposing to our board a pilot around this starting on January 1st, 2022, starting with low-income riders and then going to students, which would be about 75% of our ridership right there, just those two groups. And so we are saying to this administration, if you want a quick win on equity, now you said 40% of infrastructure dollars to low-income communities. If you want a quick win, fund my fareless system with Los Angeles as the pilot. That's what I've said. Now, listen, I know that I'm dealing with what I call the transit industrial complex. They're coming after me. I mean, we are spending $100 million to collect fares a year. And that's a conservative number. $100 million is a transit industrial complex. I may need police protection myself if this thing is approved. And so we're saying, hey, let's do this. Let's take it seriously. And the impacts, the positive impacts to this, we're just scratching the surface. And I give the example of a family of four. If you got a family of four, you got two kids, they're in maybe grade school, high school, they're taking the transit, a transit pass costs $100 a month, right? So that's $100 out the family kitty. And then you got one spouse that's working, they got a pass, costs $100, $300. If you put that $300 back in that household, it could mean the difference between that family being homeless. It could mean the difference between these low-income families having something to eat on the table. And so I am challenging both the priorities of the decision makers who can decide to put money here at the local level versus someplace else. And I am challenging the federal government on Justice 40 right now. So that's it in a nutshell. We're going after this. And my hope is that that the federal government takes us up on that under Justice 40, and that it starts a wave of fareless transit all over this country.
We're going to round up the CalCog security team, and I know Bill's going to be down there. We got some thoughts about that. We had a pilot project up in this neck of the woods in the Sacramento region with RT just for students, and the pilot project just showed remarkable. I mean, credit to RT here in our backyard. More students taking the bus, more students getting to school, fewer students showing up late. And, as you know, by the end of the month, sometimes it just makes all the difference, especially for students who are in a fixed income and families. Let's shift here for 1 sec and just get to brass tacks of federal politics. You all have been around for a while and played the DC game. It used to be earmarks, earmarks, earmarks. The Senator Byrd names on highways and train stations. It looks like maybe they're back, which I find interesting because we're talking about a $3 trillion stimulus bill, and it must be that earmarks are finally the thing that might get it over the top. But I do, again, for our audience, whether they're taking virtual trips to DC or they're going to try to actually get back in person to DC this year. I have my own opinion about earmarks. The feeding frenzy, though, I think has begun. I know Toks and Secretary Kim had a call, I think, yesterday morning. What advice do you have? What advice do you have for all of us and everybody locally who might be thinking about this is finally my chance to get some earmark money for a project?
Wow. So I'm going to try to be as honest as possible. Just my personal thoughts about this.
It's always, I try to live by that. It's hard sometimes.
Yeah, I've never been a huge fan, just to be honest. I've always been a fan of setting up, funding programs or grant programs that have, clear criteria that, lead towards an intended outcome. I mean, that's more what I've been a big fan of. But what I will say is that this effort this time around, they're attempting to make sure that those mishaps from the early 2000s or the most recent earmarks that we've had, that those outcomes don't happen. So, for example, if something's funded, it needs to be in the STEP or TIP. In your MPO or in your state. I mean, setting up criteria like that. So it's not just somebody saying, hey, I want to build that bridge right there. And it's just like, where in the world does this come from? So, from that standpoint, I think this is going to be better than the prior ones. Now, it's not a ton of money we're talking about potentially, or I mean, we're talking about in the reauthorization or appropriations efforts, maximum possibly $20 to $25 million. This is not like going to be funding that completely finalizes or builds some big massive project. So that's, I think one of the key things you said there was this may be the means to the end that gets us to what we need in a true, fully comprehensive infrastructure package. So I would look at it, to be honest with you, as just that. I mean, this is a tool along the way, and I'm probably being overly harsh about this, but this is not going to be the panacea that just completely changes transportation and does every single thing we want to do. It's a little bit of a stepping a toe in the water, a little bit of seed money to get us going down to where we eventually want to be.
Other advice, insights? Are we all about to play the earmark game?
Oh, God. I guess I would say that, Toks, you are a brave man. I would say this, look, you could say that, earmarks are a version of political currency. Okay. But this is what I would say about the currency. Don't have that currency and put it under your mattress. You need to do something with it. You need to accomplish something with it. You need to solve a problem with it. So if there's sort of a moral standard to be put next to earmark or for any ask, Like I sat through lots and lots of meetings at the FTA of people coming in, you know, wanting some money or a new starts or a small starts or whatnot. And it's like, don't come asking for money. Come with a definition of a problem, how this is going to solve it, and what you're bringing to the table. That's persuasive. So if you can use that political currency in that context, then all good. So that's my little something.
And Therese, I would say, having been in DC for quite some time, what you just said about I've got a problem that I need to have you help me solve is probably one of the best pieces of lobbying advice for anybody who is connecting with their member of Congress, their staffs, the administration, US DOT. I think hat in hand, asking for money is not as good and not really gonna get you very far. I've got a problem I need you to help me solve. And here's what it is, and here's who will benefit. That will make all the difference. Any other advice on earmarks for our?
Just quickly, along the lines of following criteria, I mentioned before about STEP and TIP. We've set up in California specifically, CalSTA and Caltrans, we've set up some criteria, and there's also some federal criteria that's been set up to guide people who are interested. So if any of your communities, jurisdictions are interested, clock is kind of ticking. We need to make decisions within the next week or so. So look at the criteria that's been set up to help you along the way. But Therese mentioned about me being brave, about being honest about it. I just think this time around, it looks like the potential is that the earmarks will have different outcomes than they have in the past. We've all seen the stories of how earmarks in the past were just they ended up funding boondoggles, and they were just tools that really didn't lead to any kind of transportation and mobility change. So that's where that's coming from.
I would just say that
we're losing.
I would only add that just, it's gonna, if in fact earmarks come back in some form, it's gonna mean that like a lot of you are going to need to work in collaboration with each other to sell your delegations on whatever these are. And what I would say is like whatever the criteria is, you certainly want to speak to that. But I would also say that in this era that we're in, there will be long memories about what projects get funded through a process like this. So I would strongly encourage you to be thinking about climate as a legacy item for projects, maybe as a threshold for projects that you for. I would also encourage you broadly about the equity component that we've been talking about, because people will remember projects that don't speak to those two things. I think in this administration in particular will be looking for that, and at your congressional members will want to stand as well.
Got a lot of good, a lot of comments in the chat. I will say the student pass, fare-free transit pilot projects has just kind of lit up the chat. So if that's any suggestion of where a lot of people's hearts lie, I think you're all onto something there. Bill, time for one last question for the panel, or should we wrap?
We're with the panel. If the panel has the energy, we're along for the ride.
One of you mentioned Amtrak Joe. I just want to, and you've got the credit again to the state and Toks with your team at Caltrans who work so hard in intercity and passenger rail. We got Metrolink in Southern California. We got some of the busiest Amtrak corridors in the country that are all state supported. What's the future hold with Amtrak Joe in the White House for passenger rail, and what's the opportunity do you all think that we should be seizing here, not just for high-speed rail, but for passenger rail?
I think we've got another huge window in front of us, James. I think it's a very good question. When I think back to the era that Therese and Secretary Foxx were up there in DC. I remember vividly one press conference then Vice President Biden had with some boards behind him. This is probably in 2010. With some boards behind him laying out the rail infrastructure map for the rest of the country and saying, this is what we're going to take on. And obviously very little happened post that for several different reasons that I don't think we necessarily need to get into here, but that it didn't take off 10, 11 years ago, that plan to sort of start building and funding rail across the country. But I think now with a president that, you know, Secretary Foxx mentioned earlier, he's essentially lived his entire political career through Amtrak. He knows how important it is to people and to communities. I mean, we've got a huge window in front of us here that this can really take off. And they spent a lot of time talking about the Northeast Corridor and, you know, how much it means there. But boy, you come to California, we've got 3 lines in California that, you know, outside of the Northeast Corridor, I'm willing to bet that they're the busiest 3 lines in the country, including one that is facing some climate related challenges right now in San Diego. So huge window. And some of the proposals I've seen, again, not speaking on their behalf, but some of the proposals I've seen have put some significant dollars towards Amtrak, and including the recent bill that just passed. I can't remember exactly how much it was. I think it may have been $2 billion, but yeah, huge window in front of us. And I think we've got the right president to embrace rail more than ever.
So I would add to that. I agree with what Toks is saying, but a couple of things I would point to. And speaking of the San Diego line, I rode the train from LA to San Diego this past weekend. I mean, you know, it's the greatest thing ever, you know, seeing the country by rail, by the way. It's just my own personal preference. But I think that 3 things I would point to. We have to have a better relationship with the freights.
Mhm.
You know, I mean, building these rail lines, even if it's light rail, I mean, it's become just a chore, and not placing any blame on anybody, but it's become a chore just dealing with the freights in terms of right-of-way, purchase of right-of-way, new laws and barriers and distance from freight tracks. I mean, all of these things that had just become cost prohibitive. I mean, it's really expensive now. The second piece is we have to figure out a way to keep the cost down in building rail. I mean, and there's various reasons for it. Again, there's technical reasons for it. There's management reasons for it. There is, you know, community reasons for it. You know, that, you know, I think these projects should be self-permitting in some way. There's all kinds of reasons why these costs are getting just out of bounds. And I'm not just talking about here in California. I'm talking about all over the country. If we're going to rebuild the rail network in this country, we got to fix that. And then thirdly, I would point to the relationship between the owner, the government entities, and the contractors. This has to be more of a, you know, got you kind of proposition. There's so many claims that are besetting many of these projects around the country. We have to figure that out because voters will not keep giving us money to build infrastructure projects if we can't find a way to build them within on time and on budget. And so I think we have to figure out those 3 things. I think that this administration is leaning forward in the foxhole, if you will, to build rail, and I love it. But we got to fix a number of things for us to build out this infrastructure successfully. And then the last thing I'll say is don't forget about buses either. I mean, buses is the backbone of mobility, not just here in Southern California or California in general, but all over the country.
I would like to just add a little, I agree with absolutely everything that Phil said. And maybe it's, you know, reflecting 10 years ago, right? I was in with the administration that was launching, you know, the high-speed national program, as Toks said, and whatnot. But I think, you know, these, even if we get the cost more under control, we're talking billion-dollar programs. Like, these are the big Bs. They're big. And because they have a big cost, and because they take longer, because they're at the scale they are, I think there's a higher bar that needs to be cleared in terms of the narrative, right? I think the persuasive story about building that scale of investment has to have a very clear narrative on what, you know, how are you serving community, both the communities you go through and the communities you connect? How are you helping to lift the economy in terms of this level of investment, and you know, what is the economic contributions that you are making? And I think the new one here and is, what do you know, how is this helping with the climate? How is this helping with shaping a mobility portfolio that's different, that is really attached to alternatives that, you know, serve in reducing greenhouse gas emissions? And I think, you know, stories have to change over time and with the context. But given this administration, that kind of narrative is reflecting what they're bringing to the table in terms of their priorities. And I think it would do well for any, you know, coalition of rail supporters to really think strategically about that story and justification, and building, you know, a support behind it.
Well, I really enjoyed this. I want to close down here and hand it back to Bill. I know we've had a number of comments on the sidebar. Lots of support for the student passes, fare free. A lot of interest in passenger rail. I can tell you in my region, it's really rekindled a lot of enthusiasm, the notion of the state rail plan and bringing it back. I do want to recognize Mary Lily May from Fremont, saying, please kindly remember the AAPI communities as the historic areas that have also been impacted by our transportation decisions of the past. Thank you, Mayor May, for that. And thanks to all of our panelists. We've got a lot of participants who have held here post lunch hour. And I think for good reason. You've given them excellent insights into the year ahead. I think this could be finally the year that Washington does something big. And I'm not just talking Phil. So thanks again to our panelists, and back to you, Bill.